Imagine living in a house for 17 years, walking across the same floors every day, doing laundry in the basement, storing Christmas decorations in boxes along the concrete walls. Now imagine discovering that behind one of those walls, sealed behind 3 feet of concrete that was poured while you slept upstairs, lies the answer to the question that has consumed your every waking moment for 7 years. Imagine learning that the daughter you searched for desperately, whose missing person posters you hung on every telephone pole in town, whose name you called out until your voice went hoarse, has been there the entire time, right below your feet, hidden by the one person you once trusted most in the world. This is exactly what happened to Susan Brown in February of 2009, when a routine home inspection revealed a secret room in her basement, a room that contained the remains of her 15-year-old daughter Melissa, and exposed her ex-husband as the monster who had murdered his own child and sealed her behind concrete while Susan spent 7 years searching everywhere except the one place Melissa had been all along. What you're about to hear is the true story of how a hidden room exposed a hidden killer, and how one mother's worst nightmare was found in the last place anyone thought to look. Before we dive into this devastating case, if you believe that every victim deserves to be found and every family deserves the truth no matter how painful it might be, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for Cold Case Unsealed. We bring you the cases that refuse to stay buried, the investigations that demand answers. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because you're part of this community that fights for justice. And smash that like button so more people can discover these stories that need to be told. Now let's go back to October of 2002 and uncover how Melissa Brown disappeared, and how the search for her would end in the most unthinkable way possible. The February wind cut through Cedar Rapids, Iowa like a knife, rattling the windows of the 2-story colonial house on Maple Grove Drive. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that made you want to stay inside wrapped in blankets with a hot cup of coffee. But Susan Brown wasn't thinking about the cold as she stood in the living room she had called home for 17 years, watching Tom Henderson, the real estate inspector, move methodically through each room with his clipboard and flashlight. At 42 years old, Susan looked older than her years. The weight of 7 winters spent searching for her missing daughter had etched permanent lines around her eyes, lines that no amount of sleep or peace would ever erase. Her hair, once a vibrant brown, was now streaked heavily with gray that she no longer bothered to color. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She was selling the house, finally letting go of the last physical connection to the life she had lived before everything fell apart. The house had become both a prison and a shrine. A prison because every room held memories that caused pain. A shrine because this was the last place Melissa had been before she vanished. The bedroom upstairs still contained Melissa's things, exactly as she had left them on the morning of October 15, 2002. The purple bedspread Melissa had picked out at Target, the posters of her favorite bands on the walls, the stack of books on the nightstand that Melissa had been reading for English class. Susan couldn't bring herself to pack any of it away, couldn't accept the finality that would represent. But financial reality had finally forced her hand. She couldn't afford to keep the house anymore. The mortgage payments were crushing her, and she was barely surviving on disability payments and occasional part-time work doing data entry from home. Her therapist, Dr. Patricia Coleman, had gently suggested that selling the house might actually be therapeutic, might help Susan begin to move forward with her life instead of remaining frozen in the moment Melissa disappeared. Susan had resisted the idea for months, but eventually she had to admit that Dr. Coleman was right. She couldn't keep the house. She could barely afford to eat. So she had contacted a real estate agent, a kind woman named Barbara Chun who had been patient and understanding about Susan's emotional attachment to the property. Barbara had suggested getting a pre-sale home inspection to identify any issues that might affect the sale price or scare off potential buyers. That's how Tom Henderson came to be there on that cold February morning, conducting his thorough examination of every aspect of the house. Henderson was in his mid-50s, a licensed home inspector with an excellent reputation in Cedar Rapids. He had been doing this work for 20 years and had seen just about everything a house could hide, from termite damage to faulty wiring to foundations cracked by decades of Iowa's harsh freeze-thaw cycles. Susan had followed Henderson from room to room for the first hour of the inspection, answering his questions about when the roof had been replaced, when the furnace had been serviced, what work had been done to the plumbing over the years. But eventually she had grown tired and retreated to the living room, letting Henderson work on his own while she sat on the couch and stared at nothing in particular, lost in memories and what-ifs. "Mrs. Brown," Henderson's voice called from somewhere below, pulling Susan from her thoughts. "Could you come down to the basement for a moment?" Susan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold outside. The basement. She hated the basement. She had avoided going down there as much as possible for years now, ever since Melissa disappeared. There was something about that space that made her deeply uncomfortable, though she had never been able to articulate exactly what bothered her about it. The basement was unfinished, a maze of concrete walls and exposed pipes and dusty corners that Richard, her ex-husband, had always promised to renovate but never got around to completing. He had started some work down there back in 2001, she remembered, something about reinforcing the foundation after they had noticed some cracks in the concrete. Richard had insisted on doing the work himself rather than hiring a professional, said it would save them money. He had spent weeks working down there at odd hours, often late at night or when Susan and Melissa weren't home. Susan slowly descended the narrow wooden stairs, her hand gripping the railing tightly for support. The basement was dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the concrete walls. It smelled of dampness and old cardboard and something else she couldn't quite identify, something that made her stomach turn slightly. Henderson stood near the far wall, the one in the back corner that was partially hidden behind the old water heater. He was tapping his knuckles against the concrete in a rhythmic pattern, his ear close to the wall, listening intently to the sounds he was producing. "Hear that?" he asked Susan, continuing his methodical knocking. "Solid, solid, solid, hollow." The sound changed distinctly when he moved his hand to a particular section of the wall. Instead of the dull thud of knuckles on solid concrete, there was a different quality to the sound, something that suggested empty space beyond. Henderson pulled a measuring tape from his tool belt and began taking measurements, comparing the dimensions of the interior basement space to the exterior dimensions of the house that he had measured earlier. He scribbled numbers on his clipboard, did some calculations, then looked at Susan with a puzzled expression. "There's a void behind this wall," he said, tapping the area again to demonstrate. "Maybe 3 feet deep, roughly 6 feet wide and 7 feet high. That's not standard construction for a house built in 1985. He paused, studying his measurements again. "And here's what's really odd. The exterior dimensions of your basement don't match the interior dimensions. You're missing about 40 square feet of space somewhere." He marked an X on the wall with a piece of white chalk he had in his pocket. "Right about here. There's definitely a sealed-off area behind this concrete." Susan's pulse quickened as she stared at the X. Her mouth went dry. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would there be a void?" "Could be a lot of things," Henderson said, putting his measuring tape away. "Old foundation settling, creating a gap. A sealed-off storage area that was blocked in at some point. Sometimes older houses have weird construction quirks." He knocked on the wall again, listening carefully. "But the concrete here sounds newer than the rest of the foundation. Different composition, different density." Susan reached out and touched the cold concrete where Henderson had marked the X, her fingers trembling. "Richard did some work down here back in 2001, she said slowly, her mind racing through memories she had buried long ago. "He said he was reinforcing the foundation after we had some cracks. He did it all himself, wouldn't let me come down here while he was working. Said it was too dangerous with all the tools and concrete dust." Henderson looked at her carefully, his experienced eyes reading something in her expression that made him set down his clipboard. "Mrs. Brown," he said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense. Your real estate agent mentioned that you had a family tragedy, that your daughter went missing some years ago. How old was she when she disappeared?" Susan felt the world tilt slightly. 15, she whispered, staring at the X on the wall. Melissa was 15 years old. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, and Susan could practically see him doing the math in his head, putting together the timeline. Foundation work in 2001. A daughter who went missing in 2002. A sealed void behind newly poured concrete in a basement. Mrs. Brown, Henderson said carefully, I think you need to call the police, right now. Susan stood there in that basement, the cold February air somehow finding its way down the stairs and wrapping around her. And suddenly everything that had never made sense began to make terrible, horrifying sense. The timing of Richard's foundation work, just a year before Melissa vanished. The way he had been so secretive about it, so insistent that Susan stay away while he was working. How he had worked down here at strange hours, sometimes in the middle of the night when he thought Susan was asleep. The one time Susan had come down to check on his progress and he had snapped at her, told her to get out, that she was interfering. She had dismissed all of it at the time as Richard being his usual controlling, do-it-yourself self. Richard liked to be in charge of projects, liked to do things his own way without anyone questioning him. It was one of the many things that had contributed to their marriage falling apart. But now, standing in this basement staring at that chalk X on the wall, Susan felt sick with the possibility of what that sealed space might contain. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Susan dialed 911. To understand how we got to this moment in the basement, we need to go back 7 years, to October 15, 2002, the day Melissa Brown disappeared and Susan's life changed forever. October 15th was a Tuesday, and it had started as an utterly ordinary autumn day in Cedar Rapids. The temperature was mild, around 60 degrees, with clear blue skies and the kind of crisp air that makes you glad to be alive. The trees lining Maple Grove Drive were dressed in their fall colors, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Melissa Brown was a 15-year-old sophomore at Jefferson High School, a typical teenager in most respects. She was an average student who got mostly B's and C's in her classes. Not particularly ambitious about academics, but not failing either. She had a small group of close friends, girls she had known since elementary school. She liked music and movies and spending time at the mall. She had recently developed an interest in photography and had been saving her allowance to buy a better camera. That morning, Melissa had gotten up at 6:30, taken a shower, gotten dressed in jeans and her favorite purple hoodie, and come down to the kitchen where Susan was making breakfast. Susan always made breakfast for Melissa on school days, usually scrambled eggs and toast, sometimes pancakes if there was time. "Morning, sweetie," Susan had said, sliding a plate across the counter to where Melissa sat on a bar stool. "Big plans for today? Algebra test?" Melissa had groaned, poking at her eggs with a fork. "I'm going to fail. I don't understand any of it." "You studied last night. You'll do fine." "I studied for like 10 minutes before I gave up and watched TV instead." Susan had sighed but didn't push it. She had learned that nagging Melissa about schoolwork only made her dig in her heels more. "Well, do your best. That's all anyone can ask." They had eaten breakfast together, making small talk about Melissa's plans for the upcoming weekend. There was a school dance on Friday night that Melissa was excited about. She and her friends Jennifer and Ashley were planning to go together. Susan had promised to take Melissa shopping after school on Thursday to look for something to wear. At 7:15, Melissa had grabbed her backpack, kissed Susan on the cheek, and headed out to catch the school bus that stopped at the corner of Maple Grove Drive and Oak Street. Susan had watched from the front window as Melissa walked down the driveway, her purple hoodie bright against the autumn leaves. She had watched Melissa reach the corner and join the small group of other students waiting for the bus. She had watched the yellow school bus pull up, watched Melissa climb aboard and disappear from view. "I'll see you after school, Mom," had been the last words Melissa spoke to her mother. Susan had gone to work at the elementary school where she taught kindergarten, spent the day with her class of 5-year-olds doing activities about autumn leaves and Halloween, and returned home around 3:30 in the afternoon expecting to find Melissa already there or arriving shortly after. But Melissa never came home. 3:30, Susan wasn't concerned. Sometimes Melissa stayed after school to work on projects or hang out with friends. At 4 o'clock, Susan started to feel the first little flutter of worry, but she told herself she was being an overprotective mother. At 4:30, she called Melissa's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. At 5 o'clock, The flutter had become a knot of genuine concern. Susan called Melissa's best friend, Jennifer Martinez. "Hey, Mrs. Brown," Jennifer had answered cheerfully. "What's up? Is Melissa with you, honey?" "No, I haven't seen her since lunch." "Why?" "She's not home yet. I thought maybe you two were hanging out." "No, sorry. We were supposed to study together tonight, but not until after dinner. She should be home by now, shouldn't she?" Susan thanked Jennifer and hung up, her worry intensifying. She called 2 other friends from Melissa's circle. Neither of them had seen Melissa after school ended at 2:45. She called the school office, but it was after hours and she only got the answering machine. By 6 o'clock, Susan was pacing the living room, calling Melissa's phone every few minutes, getting voicemail every time. She kept telling herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe Melissa's phone had died. Maybe she had gotten distracted and lost track of time. Maybe she had gone somewhere with friends and forgotten to tell Susan. But even as Susan tried to calm herself with these explanations, a deeper part of her knew something was wrong. Melissa was generally a responsible kid. She knew to call if she was going to be late. She knew Susan worried. Even in her teenage rebellion phase, Melissa had never just disappeared for hours without any contact. At 6:15, Susan called Richard. They had been divorced for 2 years, and their relationship had settled into a cold but functional co-parenting arrangement. Richard had remarried quickly after the divorce to a much younger woman named Linda, which had been a source of ongoing tension between him and Susan. But they had managed to put their differences aside for Melissa's sake. "Richard, is Melissa with you?" Susan asked when he answered, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "No, why would she be with me? It's not my weekend. She didn't come home from school. I can't reach her on her cell phone. I've called all her friends and nobody's seen her." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Susan could hear Linda's voice in the background asking who was calling. "Did you two have a fight this morning or something?" Richard asked. "Maybe she's just avoiding you, giving you the silent treatment." "We didn't fight. Everything was completely normal." "Richard, I'm really worried. Kids her age do this, Susan. They get dramatic, they want attention, they stay out late to make their parents worry. Give her a few more hours. She'll come home when she's ready." "I don't think that's what this is." "Well, what do you want me to do about it? I'm 40 minutes away and I have dinner on the table." Susan had felt a flash of anger at his dismissive tone, but she bit it back. "If you hear from her, call me immediately." "Yeah, sure. But she's probably fine, Susan. Try not to be so paranoid." Susan had hung up feeling even more alone and frightened than before. She grabbed her car keys and drove to Jefferson High School. The building was locked and dark, classes having ended hours ago, but Susan walked around the entire perimeter calling Melissa's name, looking in every corner where a teenager might be hanging out. She checked the parking lot, the sports fields, the picnic tables where students sometimes gathered. There was no sign of Melissa anywhere. Susan drove around Cedar Rapids for the next 2 hours, checking every place she could think of where Melissa might be. The mall where Melissa liked to shop, the movie theater, the park where Melissa sometimes met up with friends, the coffee shop where teenagers hung out, the arcade. She drove past the homes of several of Melissa's friends, but Melissa wasn't at any of them. By 8 o'clock that evening, Susan's worry had transformed into full-blown panic. She called the Cedar Rapids Police Department and reported Melissa missing. The call was answered by Officer David Martinez, a patrol officer with about 5 years on the force. Martinez was sympathetic but realistic as Susan poured out her story. "Ma'am, I understand you're worried, but I need to be straight with you. Teenage runaways are extremely common. Most of them return home within 24 to 48 hours on their own. They get into an argument with their parents, or they're stressed about school, or they just want to assert their independence." "Melissa wouldn't do that," Susan insisted. "We didn't fight. She was happy this morning. She was looking forward to a school dance this weekend. She wouldn't just leave." "I'm going to take a full report," Martinez assured her, "and we'll start looking for her. But in the vast majority of these cases, the teenager shows up safe within a day or two. Try not to panic just yet." Martinez took detailed notes. Melissa's full name, Melissa N. Brown. Age 15 years old. Height, 5 feet 4 inches. Weight, approximately 115 pounds. Hair, brown, shoulder length. Eyes green. Last seen wearing jeans, a purple hoodie, white sneakers. Distinguishing marks: a small scar on her left knee from a bike accident when she was 10, a birthmark shaped like a strawberry on her right shoulder blade. Does Melissa have a boyfriend? Martinez asked. Any romantic relationship that might have gone bad? No boyfriend, Susan said. She's talked about a couple boys at school she thought were cute, but nothing serious. Any problems at home? Trouble at school? Drug or alcohol use? No, nothing like that. She's a normal teenager. She gets moody sometimes, but that's just being 15. She's a good kid. Martinez continued his questions, building a profile of Melissa and the circumstances of her disappearance. When he was finished, he gave Susan his card and promised that patrol units would keep an eye out for Melissa throughout the night. Call me immediately if she comes home or if you hear from her, Martinez said, and try to get some rest. I know that's easier said than done, but you need to take care of yourself too. But Susan couldn't rest. She spent the entire night sitting in the living room, alternating between calling Melissa's phone and staring out the window hoping to see her daughter walking up the driveway. She called Jennifer Martinez 3 more times during the night, waking the poor girl up, asking if she had heard anything or remembered anything that might be important. Dawn came on October 16th with still no sign of Melissa. Susan hadn't slept at all. She was exhausted and terrified and felt like she might throw up at any moment. At 7 in the morning, she called the police again, demanding to speak with someone about her missing daughter. This time she was connected to Detective James Morrison, a veteran investigator with the Cedar Rapids Police Department's Persons Unit. Morrison had been on the force for 23 years and had handled dozens of missing persons cases, though most of them had involved young children or elderly individuals with dementia rather than teenagers. Morrison arranged to come to the house at 9 that morning to conduct a thorough interview. He arrived exactly on time, a tall man in his early 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much tragedy over his career. He sat with Susan at the kitchen table and went through everything again in even more detail than Officer Martinez had the night before. Tell me about Melissa's relationship with her father, Morrison said at one point. You mentioned you're divorced. How does Melissa get along with her ex-husband? They have a good relationship, Susan said. The divorce was hard on Melissa at first, but she adjusted. She sees Richard every other weekend. They do normal father-daughter things, go to movies, have dinner, that kind of thing. Richard's remarried now to a woman named Linda. Melissa likes her well enough, though she's not thrilled about having a stepmother. And your relationship with Richard? Is it contentious? Susan hesitated. We're not friends, if that's what you're asking. The divorce was difficult, but we're civil to each other for Melissa's sake. We don't fight in front of her. What caused the divorce, if you don't mind me asking? Richard had an affair with Linda. That's who he's married to now. I found out, filed for divorce, and that was that. It happened 2 years ago. Morrison made notes on all of this, his expression neutral and professional. And Richard's whereabouts yesterday? Did you speak with him? I called him around 6:15 yesterday evening when I realized Melissa was missing. He said he hadn't seen her and basically implied I was overreacting. Where was Richard yesterday during the day? At work, I assume. He's an accountant. Works for Harrison Financial Services downtown. Morrison said he would need to interview Richard as well, along with Melissa's friends, teachers, and anyone else who might have information about her disappearance or state of mind. He also asked Susan's permission to examine Melissa's room, her computer, her cell phone records, her social media accounts, anything that might provide clues about where she had gone or what had happened to her. Susan agreed to everything immediately. She would have agreed to anything if it meant finding Melissa. Over the next several days, Detective Morrison conducted a thorough investigation into Melissa's disappearance. He interviewed everyone who knew her. Teachers at Jefferson High School described Melissa as a quiet, average student who didn't cause trouble but didn't particularly stand out either. Friends described her as funny and loyal, someone who was always there when you needed her. None of them could think of any reason why Melissa would run away or any indication that she was in trouble. Morrison also interviewed Richard Brown at his office downtown. Richard was cooperative but seemed somewhat detached, as if Melissa's disappearance was an inconvenience rather than a crisis. He confirmed that he had last seen Melissa on Sunday, October 13th, 2 days before she vanished. She had spent the weekend at his house as usual. They had gone to see a movie, had dinner at a restaurant, and he had dropped her back at Susan's house around 7 in the evening. "How did she seem to you that weekend?" Morrison asked. "Was anything bothering her? Did she seem upset or worried about anything?" "She seemed fine," Richard said with a shrug. "Totally normal. We had a nice weekend." "Any arguments between you two? Any conflicts?" "No, nothing like that. We get along great. I'm the fun parent, you know? Susan's always on her case about homework and chores. When Melissa's with me, we just relax and have a good time." Morrison asked Richard to account for his whereabouts on October 15th, the day Melissa disappeared. Richard pulled up his work calendar and showed Morrison his schedule for that day. He had been in the office from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, attending meetings and working on client accounts. His assistant and several co-workers could verify his presence throughout the day. Morrison checked Richard's alibi thoroughly. It was solid. Richard had indeed been at work all day, with multiple witnesses confirming his presence at various times. There was no window during which Richard could have left the office, picked up Melissa from school, done something to her, and returned to work without anyone noticing his absence. Richard Brown was eliminated as a suspect in his daughter's disappearance. If you're still with me at this point in the story, I need to know. Drop a comment right now saying, "I am here," so I can see that you're as invested in uncovering what happened to Melissa as I am. Your engagement helps bring these crucial stories to more people who care about justice for victims and their families. Search parties were organized to look for Melissa throughout Cedar Rapids and the surrounding areas. Volunteers from the community showed up in droves. Dozens and then hundreds of people who wanted to help find the missing teenager. They spread out across the city, searching through parks, wooded areas, along riverbanks, anywhere a person might be hiding or might have met with foul play. Melissa's photo was distributed to every police department in Iowa and neighboring states. Her picture appeared on the local news every evening, usually accompanied by footage of Susan making tearful pleas for Melissa to come home or for anyone with information to contact the police. Susan's face became familiar to everyone in Cedar Rapids, a haunting image of a mother's desperate grief. Tips came into the police hotline constantly. Someone thought they saw a girl matching Melissa's description at a bus station in Des Moines. Another caller reported seeing her at a truck stop outside of Iowa City. A woman in Waterloo was certain she had seen Melissa at a shopping mall. Every tip was investigated thoroughly by Morrison and his team, but none of them panned out. Every reported sighting turned out to be a different girl, someone who resembled Melissa but wasn't her. As October turned to November and then December with no trace of Melissa, the case began to go cold in the official sense, though it remained burning hot in Susan's heart. The daily searches were scaled back. The media coverage decreased. The tips stopped coming in as frequently. Life in Cedar Rapids gradually returned to normal for everyone except Susan, for whom nothing would ever be normal again. Detective Morrison kept the case open and continued to follow up on occasional leads. But there was simply nowhere left to look, no new evidence to examine, no obvious direction for the investigation to take. Melissa had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind nothing but grief and unanswered questions. During the months following Melissa's disappearance, Susan's relationship with Richard deteriorated even further. They had never gotten along well since the divorce, but now they could barely speak to each other without arguing. Susan became convinced that Richard wasn't taking Melissa's disappearance seriously enough, wasn't doing enough to help find their daughter, wasn't sufficiently devastated by the loss. "You act like she's already dead," Susan accused him during one particularly heated phone conversation in early 2003. "You've just given up on her." "I haven't given up," Richard said, his voice cold. "But I'm also being realistic, Susan. It's been 4 months. The police have done everything they can. At a certain point, you have to accept reality and try to move forward. Move forward? How can you even say that? Our daughter is missing, and destroying yourself isn't going to bring her back. You need to see a therapist, Susan. You're becoming obsessed. Susan had hung up on him, furious and hurt, but a part of her knew he was right about one thing: she was becoming obsessed. She spent every waking moment thinking about Melissa, searching for Melissa, organizing volunteer search parties, maintaining websites and social media pages dedicated to finding Melissa. She had taken a leave of absence from her teaching job that turned into permanent unemployment when she couldn't bring herself to return. Her entire life had become about finding her daughter. In 2003, Richard and Linda had a baby, a boy they named Marcus. When Susan learned about this, she felt a betrayal so profound she could barely breathe. How could Richard start a new family when Melissa was still missing? How could he move on and have another child as if Melissa didn't matter, as if she could simply be replaced? Susan confronted Richard about it when he came to the house to pick up some of Melissa's belongings that Linda wanted to put in storage. They got into a screaming match in the driveway, with neighbors watching from behind curtains. "You've forgotten her," Susan shouted. "You've replaced her with your new perfect family." "I haven't forgotten Melissa," Richard said, his jaw tight with anger. "But I also have to live my life, Susan. I can't spend the rest of my existence frozen in place waiting for something that's probably never going to happen." "Get out," Susan said, her voice shaking. "Get out of my house and don't come back." As the years passed, Susan's financial situation became increasingly desperate. She had gone through her savings searching for Melissa. She had maxed out credit cards paying for private investigators and flyers and reward money. In 2004, she filed for bankruptcy, losing almost everything she owned except the house on Maple Grove Drive. The bank had wanted to foreclose on the house, but Susan's lawyer had managed to negotiate a deal that allowed her to keep it as long as she stayed current on a modified payment plan. Susan did whatever work she could find that would allow her to continue her search efforts. She did data entry from home. She worked part-time at a grocery store. She sold items on eBay. Every penny she earned went toward either keeping the house or continuing to search for Melissa. Friends and family tried to be supportive, but eventually most of them drifted away. They didn't know what to say anymore. They had run out of comforting words and platitudes. And if Susan was being honest with herself, she knew she had become difficult to be around. She talked about nothing except Melissa. She had no other topics of conversation, no other interests, no other reason for existing except to find her daughter. In 2006, Susan started seeing Dr. Patricia Coleman, a therapist who specialized in grief and trauma. Dr. Coleman was a patient, compassionate woman in her 60s who had been practicing for more than 30 years. She worked with Susan on processing her grief and learning coping mechanisms to deal with the overwhelming anxiety and depression that had consumed her life. "Have you considered the possibility that Melissa might not be alive?" Dr. Coleman asked gently during one session in early 2007, nearly 5 years after Melissa's disappearance. "I can't," Susan said, shaking her head. "I can't accept that. If she's dead, then I'll know. A mother knows. And I don't feel like she's gone. I feel like she's out there somewhere. But what if she's not? What if the worst has happened? You can't heal if you don't allow yourself to grieve. I'll grieve when I have proof. Until then, there's still hope." Dr. Coleman didn't push the issue, but she continued to work with Susan on managing her mental health and finding ways to live with the uncertainty that had become her constant companion. By 2009, 7 years after Melissa's disappearance, Susan had reached what felt like rock bottom. She was barely surviving financially. She had no social life. She had pushed away most of the people who had tried to help her. She existed in a state of perpetual limbo, unable to move forward but unable to let go. The house on Maple Grove Drive, the last tangible connection to the life she had lived with Melissa, had become both a burden and a lifeline. Susan couldn't afford to keep it anymore. The mortgage was killing her financially, but the thought of leaving, of selling the house and moving somewhere else, felt like abandoning Melissa somehow. What if Melissa came home and Susan wasn't there? What if she tried to find her way back to Maple Grove Drive and discovered strangers living in the house? But reality couldn't be ignored forever. In January of 2009, Susan finally accepted that she had to sell. Dr. Coleman had convinced her that it wasn't a betrayal of Melissa, that Susan could leave forwarding information, that Melissa would be able to find her if she came back, that holding on to the house was destroying Susan financially and emotionally. With a heavy heart, Susan contacted Barbara Chun, a real estate agent who came highly recommended. Barbara was understanding and patient as Susan explained her situation and her emotional attachment to the house. They agreed that the first step would be getting a home inspection to identify any issues that needed to be addressed before putting the house on the market. That's how Tom Henderson, the home inspector, came to be standing in Susan's basement on that cold February morning, making a discovery that would change everything. After Henderson found the void behind the basement wall and urged Susan to call the police, events moved quickly. Susan called 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. She explained to the dispatcher that she was Susan Brown, mother of missing girl Melissa Brown, and that a home inspector had found a sealed room in her basement and she needed officers to come immediately. The dispatcher tried to get more details, but Susan was barely coherent, her words tumbling over each other as 7 years of pent-up fear and grief and desperate hope came spilling out. Within minutes, multiple patrol cars were dispatched to Maple Grove Drive. The first officers on scene were uncertain how to proceed. A sealed room in a basement could mean many things, most of them innocent. But given the history of the house and the missing daughter, they called Detective Morrison, who was now in a different department but had never forgotten the Melissa Brown case. Morrison arrived within an hour, bringing with him 2 other detectives and a cadaver dog named Rex, a German shepherd trained to detect human remains. Susan stood in the backyard, unable to bear being in the house while they conducted their investigation, but also unable to leave. Rex was taken down to the basement and led to the area Henderson had identified. The dog alerted immediately, sitting down and barking, the signal that indicated the presence of human remains. Morrison's face went pale. He had hoped, desperately hoped, that this would turn out to be nothing, that the void would contain old storage items or would simply be an architectural quirk. But Rex didn't give false alerts. Morrison obtained an emergency warrant from a judge to breach the wall. By early evening, a team of forensic investigators had arrived with concrete saws, jackhammers, and other equipment necessary to carefully break through the concrete without disturbing whatever might be on the other side. Susan was asked to leave the property during this process, to go stay with a friend or family member while the investigation proceeded. But Susan refused absolutely. She needed to be there. She needed to know. If Melissa was behind that wall, if her daughter had been there the entire time Susan had been searching everywhere else, then Susan needed to be there when she was found. Morrison didn't have the heart to force the issue. He arranged for a victim advocate named Patricia Sanders to stay with Susan in the backyard, to provide support and keep her away from the basement while the forensic team worked. Susan sat on the back steps wrapped in a blanket, Patricia beside her, both women silent as the sun slowly set and darkness fell over Cedar Rapids. The sound of the concrete saw was horrible, a screaming mechanical shriek that seemed to go on forever. Susan could hear it clearly even from outside, could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. She hugged herself tightly, rocking slightly back and forth, praying and crying and trying to prepare herself for whatever came next. It took several hours to carefully cut through the concrete wall. The forensic team had to work slowly and methodically, photographing and documenting everything, ensuring that no evidence was disturbed or destroyed in the process. Concrete dust filled the basement, making it necessary for everyone to wear protective masks and eye protection. Finally, around 9 o'clock that evening, a section of the wall was removed. Detective Morrison and the lead forensic investigator, Dr. Helen Chong, shined powerful flashlights into the void that had been hidden for so long. There, in a space roughly 3 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and 7 feet tall, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting that had been secured with duct tape, were skeletal remains. Even without a detailed examination, it was clear they were the remains of a young person. Small bones arranged in the position they would have been in when the body was placed there and the wall sealed. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, overcome with a wave of grief and anger. He had hoped he was wrong. He had hoped that Rex had made a mistake, that this would turn out to be a dead animal or old building materials or anything except what he was looking at. But there was no mistaking what he was seeing. This was a body, and given the size and location, it was almost certainly Melissa Brown. He went outside to where Susan was waiting. The moment she saw his face, she knew. She started shaking her head, making a sound that was more animal than human, a keening wail that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. "I'm so sorry, Susan," Morrison said, his own voice breaking. "We found remains. We'll need to do formal identification, but..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Susan collapsed, her legs simply giving out beneath her. Patricia caught her before she hit the ground, holding her as she sobbed, screaming Melissa's name over and over into the cold February night. The remains were carefully extracted from the hidden room over the next several hours. Every step was photographed and documented. The plastic sheeting was examined for trace evidence. The concrete around the void was analyzed. The entire basement became a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape, swarming with investigators and technicians. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office for formal examination and identification. Dr. Robert Chen, the county medical examiner, conducted a thorough autopsy. The bones were small and delicate, consistent with a teenage female. Dental records were compared to Melissa Brown's dental records from her last dentist visit in September of 2002, just a month before she disappeared. The dental records matched. The remains were definitively identified as Melissa and Brown. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull. Melissa had been struck multiple times in the head with a heavy object, causing massive fractures to her skull. She would have died quickly, Dr. Chan assured Susan, probably within minutes of the assault. It was small comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Melissa hadn't suffered for long. The medical examiner estimated that Melissa had been dead for approximately 7 years, which aligned with when she had disappeared. She had been killed around the time of her disappearance and had been sealed in that basement wall almost immediately afterward. Once the remains were positively identified and the cause of death determined, the investigation shifted entirely. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a homicide investigation, and there was one obvious suspect: Richard Brown. He had done construction work on that exact basement wall in 2001, just a year before Melissa disappeared. He had claimed to be reinforcing the foundation, but what he had actually done was create a void space large enough to hide a body. He had done the work himself, refusing to let anyone else see what he was doing. He had worked at odd hours, often late at night when Susan was asleep, and his alibi for the day Melissa disappeared, while seemingly solid, only covered the time when Melissa should have been at school and immediately after. It didn't account for what happened if Melissa never made it to school at all. What if Richard had intercepted her before she got on the bus that morning? What if he had picked her up, brought her to the house while Susan was at work, killed her and sealed her in the wall, all before reporting to his office by 8 in the morning? Detective Morrison pulled all the records from the original investigation and began reviewing them with fresh eyes, looking at Richard not as a grieving father but as a potential murderer. He looked at Richard's phone records from October 15, 2002. There were several calls to and from Richard's cell phone that morning before 8 o'clock, but that wasn't unusual. Richard always made business calls during his commute to work. Morrison obtained Richard's work computer and had it forensically examined. He obtained warrants for Richard's bank records, credit card statements, and any other financial documents that might show suspicious activity around the time of Melissa's death. He had forensic teams search Richard's current home, the one he shared with Linda and their son Marcus, looking for any evidence that might connect him to Melissa's murder. On February 23, 2009, 2 weeks after Melissa's remains were discovered, Detective Morrison arrested Richard Brown at his office. Richard was in the middle of a meeting with a client when 2 officers walked in and asked him to step outside. "Richard Brown, you're under arrest for the murder of Melissa and Brown," Morrison said, reading Richard his Miranda rights as officers handcuffed him. Richard's face went pale. "I didn't kill Melissa," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know what you think you've found, but I had nothing to do with this." "You built that wall where we found her body," Morrison said. "You created that space and you sealed it with concrete. That was your construction project." "I was reinforcing the foundation. There were cracks. I was trying to fix them." "We had a structural engineer examine that wall, Richard. There were no foundation cracks in that area. There was no structural reason for the work you did. You built a tomb for your daughter and then you sealed her inside it." Richard was transported to the county jail and booked on charges of first-degree murder. His bail was set at $2 million, an amount he couldn't possibly make. He would remain in custody awaiting trial. The news of Richard's arrest made headlines across Iowa and beyond. The tragic story of Melissa Brown, missing for 7 years and found sealed in a wall in her own home, murdered by her own father, captured national attention. Susan found herself thrust back into the media spotlight, but this time with a very different narrative. Not a mother desperately searching for her missing daughter, but a mother who had unwittingly lived for years above her daughter's hidden grave. The media attention was intense and invasive. Reporters camped outside Susan's house, trying to get comments, trying to get her to talk about her feelings, about Richard, about how she had missed the signs. Susan stopped leaving the house except when absolutely necessary. She couldn't bear the cameras, the questions, the sympathy mixed with morbid curiosity. Richard remained in jail awaiting trial, and as the months passed, more details about the case emerged through court filings and pre-trial motions. Prosecutors built their case methodically, using forensic evidence, timeline analysis, and Richard's own actions to construct a narrative of what had happened. Their theory was this: on the morning of October 15, 2002, Richard had called Melissa's cell phone before she left for school. He had told her there was a family emergency, that she needed to come to the house on Maple Grove Drive immediately instead of getting on the school bus. Melissa, trusting her father, had done as he asked. Richard had been at the house waiting for her. Susan had already left for work, as Richard would have known from years of living with her and knowing her schedule. The house was empty. Richard had confronted Melissa about something, exactly what remained unclear, but an argument had escalated. Richard had lost his temper and struck Melissa with a hammer he had been using for work around the house. When Melissa fell and didn't get up, Richard had panicked. He couldn't call for an ambulance without being arrested for assault or worse. He couldn't take her to a hospital, so he made a calculated decision. He wrapped Melissa's body in plastic sheeting he had stored in the basement from his construction project the previous year. He placed her body in the void space he had created, the space he had built specifically for this purpose, perhaps having fantasized about it, perhaps having planned it for longer than anyone wanted to believe. Then Richard had mixed concrete and sealed the wall, entombing his daughter behind 3 feet of solid concrete. He had cleaned up any blood or evidence from the attack. He had disposed of Melissa's backpack, cell phone, and anything else that might identify her. Then he had calmly gone to work, arriving at his office by 8 o'clock with no one suspecting anything was wrong. When Susan called him that evening in a panic because Melissa hadn't come home from school, Richard had played his part perfectly, concerned but not overly so, suggesting Melissa had probably just run off and would be back soon, helping with the search efforts while knowing exactly where Melissa was the entire time. For 7 years, Richard had lived with this secret. He had attended vigils for Melissa. He had given interviews expressing hope that she would be found. He had started a new family and moved on with his life, all while Melissa's body decomposed in a wall in the basement of the house where Susan still lived. The defense attorney assigned to represent Richard argued that the evidence was circumstantial. Yes, Richard had done construction work on that wall, but that didn't prove he had killed Melissa. Yes, the timing was suspicious, but that didn't constitute proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense claimed that someone else could have killed Melissa and hidden her body in that space, that perhaps Susan herself was involved and was now conveniently blaming Richard. But the prosecution's case was strong, and it only got stronger when forensic analysts examined trace evidence from the plastic sheeting that had wrapped Melissa's body. They found several hairs that had been trapped in the tape used to seal the plastic. DNA analysis of those hairs matched Richard Brown's DNA profile with a probability of over 99.99%. Richard had been in direct contact with the materials used to hide Melissa's body. The trial of Richard Brown began in November of 2009, nearly a year after Melissa's remains had been discovered. Susan attended every single day of the trial, sitting in the front row of the gallery, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to remember what he had done. She wanted him to feel the weight of her grief and rage every moment he sat in that courtroom. The prosecution presented their case over 2 weeks. They called forensic experts who explained how Melissa had died. They called the medical examiner who described the injuries to Melissa's skull. They called structural engineers who testified that the construction work Richard had done in the basement had no legitimate purpose other than creating a hidden space. They called DNA experts who explained how Richard's hair had been found on the materials used to wrap Melissa's body. They also presented phone records showing that Richard had called Melissa's phone at 6:45 on the morning she disappeared, before she would have left for school. They presented testimony from neighbors who remembered seeing Richard's truck parked at the house on Maple Grove Drive on the morning of October 15th, even though he was supposed to be on his way to work. The defense put on a weak case, primarily attacking the credibility of the prosecution's experts and suggesting that the evidence could be interpreted in different ways. Richard himself chose not to testify, which was his constitutional right, but which many observers felt damaged his case. If he was innocent, why wouldn't he take the stand and say so? The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Richard showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask. Susan, however, broke down sobbing, not from relief or satisfaction, but from the overwhelming grief of finally knowing the truth, of finally having it confirmed that the man she had once loved, the man she had married and built a life with, had murdered their daughter and hidden her body while Susan searched desperately for her. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. The judge heard victim impact statements from Susan and from several of Melissa's friends who wanted to speak about the girl they had known and loved. Susan's statement was heartbreaking and powerful. "You took everything from me," she said, looking directly at Richard for the first time since the trial began. "You took my daughter, my baby, my reason for living. You took 7 years of my life that I spent searching for her, not knowing if she was alive or dead, suffering or safe. You let me tear myself apart with grief and guilt and unanswered questions when you knew the whole time where she was. You knew she was right there, in our house, and you said nothing." Her voice grew stronger, filled with anger now rather than grief. "You attended her vigils. You helped organize search parties. You let me believe you were grieving too, that we were sharing this loss. But you weren't grieving. You were hiding your guilt. You were living a lie while I was dying inside." Susan paused, gathering herself. "I will never forgive you. I will never understand how you could do this to your own child, to Melissa who loved you and trusted you. I hope you spend every day for the rest of your life remembering what you did to her. I hope her face haunts you. I hope you never know another moment of peace." Richard was given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing. His attorney advised him to apologize, to show remorse, to perhaps influence the judge to be more lenient. But Richard refused. "I have nothing to say," was all he offered. The judge sentenced Richard Brown to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Richard was led out of the courtroom in shackles to begin serving his sentence, Susan watched him go and felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that justice had been served, rage that Richard had shown no remorse, grief that would never fully heal, and a strange emptiness, because having the truth didn't bring Melissa back and didn't undo 7 years of suffering. Melissa Brown was finally laid to rest in a funeral service held on December 5, 2009, 7 years, 1 month, and 20 days after her death. The service was held at Cedar Rapids Community Church, a large non-denominational church that could accommodate the hundreds of people who came to pay their respects. Susan had agonized over what to say in her eulogy, how to capture who Melissa had been, how to honor her memory without focusing entirely on how she had died. In the end, she spoke about Melissa's love of photography, her terrible singing voice that she insisted on showcasing anyway, her habit of leaving post-it notes with drawings and jokes around the house to make Susan smile. She spoke about ordinary moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt precious beyond measure. Melissa's friends Jennifer and Ashley spoke about the girl they had known in middle school and the beginning of high school. They cried as they remembered sleepovers and inside jokes and plans they had made for their futures that would never come to pass. They released purple balloons, Melissa's favorite color, and watched them float up into the gray December sky. Melissa was buried in Cedar Memorial Park, in a plot Susan had purchased next to her own eventual resting place. The headstone read, Melissa and Brown, August 5, 1987 to October 15, 2002. Beloved daughter, forever 15, forever missed, forever loved. In the months and years following Richard's conviction and Melissa's funeral, Susan slowly began the process of trying to rebuild her life. Dr. Coleman helped her work through the complex trauma of losing Melissa twice, first to disappearance and then to the discovery of her murder. Susan joined support groups for parents of murdered children, finding some comfort in connecting with others who understood the particular horror of losing a child to violence. The house on Maple Grove Drive was eventually sold in 2010. Susan couldn't live there anymore, couldn't walk into that basement without seeing what had been hidden there for so long. A young couple bought the house and immediately renovated the entire basement, tearing out all the old concrete and essentially rebuilding it from scratch. They planted a small memorial garden in the backyard with a bench and purple flowers, a quiet space to honor Melissa's memory. Susan moved into a small apartment across town and slowly, painfully, began to reconstruct some semblance of a life. She started working again, first part-time and eventually full-time, as an administrative assistant at a law firm. The work kept her busy and gave her some financial stability for the first time in years. She reconnected with friends she had pushed away during the years of searching for Melissa. She found a new church community that welcomed her without judgment. But some wounds never fully heal. Susan still thinks about Melissa every single day. She still wonders what Melissa would be like now, what kind of woman she would have become. She still celebrates Melissa's birthday every year and marks the anniversary of her death with a visit to the cemetery. The grief has become a part of her, something she carries with her always but has learned to live alongside rather than being consumed by. Susan also became an advocate for missing persons and their families. She speaks at conferences and support groups about her experience, about the importance of never giving up hope but also of accepting help and taking care of one's mental health during the nightmare of having a missing loved one. She works with organizations that support families of missing children, offering the kind of understanding and empathy that can only come from someone who has lived through it. Richard Brown remains in prison, serving his life sentence. He has never expressed remorse for killing Melissa. He has never apologized to Susan or to anyone else. He has given no interviews and made no public statements since his conviction. According to prison officials, he is a model inmate who keeps to himself and causes no trouble, which somehow makes his lack of remorse even more chilling. He simply goes through his days in prison as if he hasn't done anything wrong, as if he's simply serving time for a crime he didn't commit rather than facing consequences for murdering his own daughter. Several true crime shows and documentaries have featured Melissa's case over the years, drawn to the shocking elements of a father murdering his daughter and hiding her body in a wall while the mother searched desperately for her. Susan has participated in some of these, hoping that sharing Melissa's story might help other families, might raise awareness about family violence, might contribute in some way to preventing similar tragedies. The case also led to changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted in Iowa. Police now take reports of missing teenagers more seriously from the start, rather than assuming they are runaways who will return on their own. Investigators are trained to look more carefully at family members and close associates, recognizing that the people who love us can sometimes be the people who harm us. And there's now more emphasis on preserving evidence and documenting everything thoroughly, because you never know what might become important years or even decades later. As I come to the end of Melissa's story, I want to leave you with several important thoughts. First, this case demonstrates that evil can hide in the most unexpected places. Richard Brown wasn't a stranger who snatched Melissa off the street. He was her father, someone who should have protected her above all else. He lived a double life for 7 years, presenting a normal face to the world while hiding a monstrous secret. This reminds us that we can never truly know what darkness might lurk behind closed doors, even in families that seem perfectly normal from the outside. Second, this case shows the importance of listening to our instincts. Susan said she had always felt uncomfortable in that basement but couldn't explain why. She had dismissed those feelings as irrational. Looking back, some part of her subconscious might have been picking up on subtle cues that something wasn't right about that space, about the work Richard had done there. We should never dismiss that gut feeling when something seems off, even if we can't articulate exactly what's wrong. Third, this case demonstrates why we should never give up on cold cases and missing persons investigations. Melissa's case was essentially cold for 7 years. If Susan hadn't decided to sell the house, if Tom Henderson hadn't been the inspector who noticed the discrepancy in the basement dimensions, if the cadaver dog hadn't alerted, Melissa might still be undiscovered, still sealed in that wall, and Richard would still be free. Justice came only through a combination of chance and thorough professional work by Henderson and the investigators who responded. Finally, this case is a reminder of the devastating impact of violence on families and communities. Susan didn't just lose her daughter. She lost 7 years of her life to the agony of not knowing. She lost her financial stability, her career, her mental health, many of her relationships. She will carry the trauma of what happened for the rest of her life. And Melissa, of course, lost everything. Her life stolen at 15 years old by the person who should have been her protector. Now I need you to take action. If the story has moved you, if you believe in justice for victims like Melissa and support for survivors like Susan, I need you to do 5 things right now. First, hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications for Cold Case Unsealed. We are committed to bringing you stories like Melissa's, cases that demand to be remembered, investigations that refuse to let evil hide in the shadows. Your subscription directly supports our work in bringing attention to cold cases and unsolved crimes. Second, smash that like button. Every like helps the algorithm show this video to more people, which means more awareness for cases like Melissa's, more pressure to solve cold cases, more attention on the issues of family violence and missing persons. Your engagement literally makes a difference. Third, leave a detailed comment sharing your thoughts on this case. What warning signs do you think should have been noticed? How do you think Susan found the strength to survive this? What changes should be made to how we investigate missing persons cases? Your perspectives add to the conversation and help build a community of people who care about justice. Fourth, share this video with at least 3 people. Share it on your social media. Send it to friends who care about true crime. Post it in communities that discuss unsolved cases. Every share extends Melissa's story to new audiences and helps ensure that cases like hers are never forgotten. And fifth, if you know someone who has a missing loved one, reach out to them. Let them know you're thinking of them. Don't let them face their nightmare alone. Susan talks about how isolating it was to be the mother of a missing child, how people eventually stopped knowing what to say and drifted away. Don't be that person who disappears. Be the person who stays. The case of Melissa Brown teaches us that sometimes the answers we desperately seek are hidden in places we never think to look. It teaches us that evil can wear a familiar face. It teaches us that justice, even when delayed by years, still matters. And it teaches us that families of missing persons need our continued support and advocacy, not just in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, but for as long as it takes to find answers. Thank you for being part of the Cold Case Unsealed community. Thank you for listening to Melissa's story and for caring enough about justice to watch all the way to the end. Thank you for believing that every victim deserves to be remembered and every family deserves the truth, no matter how painful that truth might be. Susan Brown once said in an interview that the worst part of not knowing what happened to Melissa was the uncertainty, the questions that had no answers. Was Melissa alive somewhere? Was she suffering? Was she calling out for help that wasn't coming? The discovery of Melissa's body, while devastating, at least provided answers. It allowed Susan to finally grieve properly, to say goodbye, to begin the long process of healing. That's what we do here at Cold Case Unsealed. We shine light on cases that have been left in darkness. We give voice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. We support families who are still waiting for answers. And we never, ever give up on finding the truth. I'll see you in the next investigation. Until then, remember that the cases may be cold, but our commitment to justice burns hot. The search for truth never ends, and no victim will ever be forgotten as long as we keep telling their stories. Rest in peace, Melissa and Brown. Your story has been told, your memory has been honored, and your killer faced justice, even though it took 7 years longer than it should have. May you finally rest easy, knowing that the truth came out and that your mother never stopped fighting for you.